So Peter, tell me about your influences. What are the influences of your former teachers, Armstrong and Stowe?
Okay, well, as regards my philosophical education, I'd actually also like to mention someone called Bill Joske, who was my teacher in Tasmania and isn't widely known, but he was the first person who really persuaded me to try to restrain my a certain kind of intellectual exuberance, to try to be precise. I've always thought that the aim of philosophy should be that sort of perfect clarity that is characteristic of analytic philosophy at its best. It's not my nature to be clear at all, it's a struggle. But Bill Joske, I think, persuaded me that that's what we should be aiming at. I always have a tendency to be obscure, but I really think that clarity, you should try to be clear. And I think that's incredibly important because, as I said before, philosophy is a subject you can do and be said to do well, even if you can't do anything well. And I see myself as one such. There's nothing I can do particularly well. What I do is dabble in a lot of things. I've got wide interests in a lot of subjects. But I can't really do anything well. If I had been able to do pure mathematics very well, I suppose I would have been a pure mathematics professor. If I'd been able to do physics well, I probably would have been a physicist. Maybe if I'd been able to do other things well, I would have done other things. But you don't have to do anything well to be a philosopher. All you've got to do is be prepared to persevere with your thought and tackle the obstacles as it comes. And both David Stowe and David Armstrong helped me in that respect as well, because, okay, the one thing David Stowe could do very well was write English prose. He was a beautiful stylist. I mean, he wasn't that good at logic and mathematics. David Armstrong, too, I mean, he was a brilliant chess player, but he wasn't that, mathematically inclined, or even, very sort of, you don't need that sort of mad intelligence that David Lewis has. I mean, if you've ever seen David Lewis, you would say, yes, this man is a mad genius. But neither David Armstrong nor David Stowe were like that. What did they teach me? Well, an abhorrence of bullshit. They really disliked anything that was silly or nonsensical or vague or waffly as the chief thing. Apart from that, they were quite different. In fact, even though they were political allies, they were both on the other side of politics from me, but David Armstrong was a libertarian, and David Stowe, one of the few intelligent conservatives I've ever met. He was an intelligent conservative simply because he was so deeply pessimistic about things. He thought it miraculous, not literally, because he didn't believe in God, but he thought it miraculous that we even had this little bit of civilization, and it was so precious, and it was crumbling, and it was bound to crumble, but all we could do was try to stop it crumbling quite so quickly. Deeply pessimistic, whereas David Armstrong was a mad libertarian who objected to constraints of any kind in principle, and so was on the right of politics. But leave aside their political views, which I think were deplorable. They were very great, formative as regards intellect. And Armstrong, again, one of the great examples Armstrong set, and he sort of mentioned himself in a way, was an acceptance of second best. You don't have to nail everything down. You can make a philosophical case just by coming up with the arguments you've got, express them as clearly as you can. You don't have to, be sure that you've covered every base. And he was really opposed to people who tried to, always work everything out in complete detail. And I think Armstrong was an example of someone who, again, I said philosophy is something you can do and be said to do very well, even though you can't do anything very well. Well, the one thing David Armstrong could do very well was actually play chess, which had nothing much to do with philosophy. You don't have to have that sort of brilliance that, say, Saul Kripke has or David Lewis used to have. This capacity to sort of see through things in 5 seconds flat. Look, it doesn't matter whether it takes you 5 years to get the point. It often does in philosophy. And I think that's something he showed me.
I am so interested about your career because you started as a mathematician, then you became a philosopher, and also you are, of course, a metaphysician, but also you are a philosopher of religion. Can you explain me this order of things? How is this related to each other? How can you... What is the relationship between mathematics, philosophy, and religion?
Well, they're two separate questions, but first, short bit of biography. It's not interesting. My life is pretty mediocre. I'm not that interesting, but the story goes like this. It's a bit like, do you know the answer to the question people used to ask, how in the 19th century did the British acquire a large empire? To which the answer was, in a fit of absent-mindedness. They sort of just acquired it. I pursued various studies for all the wrong reasons. I specialized in mathematics rather than the sciences at school and at university because if you did the sciences, you had to spend hours doing practical experiments. And I didn't want to have to do more than 30 hours work a week as a student. I then went on to do postgraduate work in the United States because I managed to win a scholarship, and I thought, well, wouldn't it be exciting to go to the United States? And here I've got this scholarship. When I got there, I decided I didn't really like maths very much, but I didn't want to be a failure, so I completed my PhD. And when I got my PhD, I decided I need a job. And so I got myself a job as a mathematician in Western Australia, the city of Perth, and which is where I met my wife, and she was the daughter of the philosophy professor there. And I decided, oh look, I can't stand this anymore. So I went first to Tasmania and then to Sydney and got some philosophy degrees. Now my interest, well, I think an interest in religion drove it all. I guess you would say that my parents were conventionally pious, genuinely practicing Catholics. I have a Roman Catholic background, which is fairly common in Australia, but not so common in England, where I came from. These questions of, well, is it true? Is there any truth in this, etc.? And a particularly formative experience was realizing that you could make some sort of case at least, I'm not going to go into details, don't worry, some sort of case at least for the existence of God as an inference to the best explanation. This was when I was puzzling about these things, before I became a philosopher. So I became a philosopher. My sort of basic interest has always been in philosophy and religion, and I don't think you need much convincing that this is important. Even if you think, as many people do in this day and age, many benighted people think that this has nothing to do with what is reason. You either choose to believe or choose not to believe, and you just choose. I don't know, it's sort of romantic, I suppose. I'm against romanticism. I think it's a curse. You just choose. I'm naturally interested in those questions. Now, Here's a very brief answer. Metaphysics is to philosophy religion as mathematics is to physics. When you do physics, the point is not to be a mathematician. You're not saying if you're a physicist, what I really want to do in life is mathematics, but I'm in a physics department. It's actually the other way around. Lots of people in mathematics departments really want to do physics, but like me, when they were students, they couldn't bear to go into a laboratory, so they end up in mathematics departments. And likewise, you don't say the whole point of religion is the underlying metaphysics. The point of religion is not whether there's a necessary being or whether, as I think, the ultimate explanation of everything is the good and beautiful, sort of Platonic, the good and beautiful. That explains it. Is that no, that's not the point of religion. The point of religion is the practice, the emotions, the way of life, and the constraint. I mean, the point is, I hold the sort of rather harsh view that there's something wrong with you if you're religious and you don't feel bloody guilty. Just an aside, that's what I've got against the Prime Minister of Australia. He claims to be religious, but he's far too cheerful. Anyway, so religion matters. It matters, I think, whether or not you're religious. It matters that it's wrong if it's wrong, and it matters that it's right if it's right. And it's not free of rational constraints. And that requires metaphysics. Now, the connections are somewhat tenuous. It's not a matter of saying, well, look, if you hold this metaphysical position, you'll be an atheist. If you hold this metaphysical position, you'll believe in God, or maybe you'll be, just as an aside, I'm a generic Catholic. I'm all the way up to the Council of Nicaea. I'm not the Pope's man, okay, if you just want to know where I am. I'm a generic Catholic, but that's not important. But it's not the case that if you hold a certain metaphysical position, you'll believe in God. The connections between intellectual positions and emotional positions and values are all much more tenuous than that. But they're there. The point is this: if on other grounds you thought naturalism was correct, you're going to be that much less likely to commit yourself to a religious belief. It's not a sort of all or nothing thing. And I'm interested in lots of topics in religion. And as an advertisement, I've just written a book on commitment, which will be out soon. But one of the things that matters is metaphysics. And in metaphysics, this analytic ontology, which can seem very abstruse and rarefied, is connected to other topics. For example, it matters both in the philosophy of science and to philosophy of religion what a law of nature is. It's a very important question. And it matters whether they're metaphysically necessary or possible or just contingent. It matters to philosophy of science because we want to know what the scientists have told us. It's no good just clapping our hands and saying, isn't science great? Aren't these people great? They are. I'm very much a nerd. I'm very much pro-science. I relax sometimes in the evening, not by reading a novel, but by looking up the science news and discovering what the latest things are. I confess to being a science nerd. Science is great, but it's not enough just to say it's great. What I want to say is that we just know a lot more now than we did hundreds of years ago. That, by the way, was David Stove's starting point. He said, look, more certain than any philosophy is that we know a lot more now than we did a few hundred years ago. I agree with him. But one of the things science, I think, helps us discover are laws of nature. Not the most fundamental ones, we haven't discovered those yet, but laws of nature. And it matters what a law of nature is, because we want to know what we've discovered. And it matters whether these things are, in some sense, contingent. And it matters a lot for philosophy of religion, whether the laws of nature are contingent or necessary. Let me just briefly digress, because I know this isn't on religion, briefly digress. But the problem of evil is easier to tackle if God cannot now break the laws of nature that she or he originally put in place. Belief in God is, in the first place, is more likely if we can explain even the laws of nature in terms of agency by invoking God. So there's a tension there. On the one hand, if the laws of nature were metaphysically necessary, the problem would be easier because you would say not even God can break them. On the other hand, God as an explanation would be less tenable if we can't explain the laws as chosen by God because they're good and beautiful. So elsewhere I have discussed this, and I have the view that many consider to be bizarre. I get a lot of incredulous stares that God is kenotic, that God was once all-powerful, but only good in a utilitarian sort of way, the sort of God you just wouldn't want to know, but God chose to become less powerful for the sake of creatures. So God cannot now break the laws of nature. Now, the only relevance of that, this present discussion, is it just shows how you have these connections, which even if they're not, they're not the iron laws of logic, do show how one intellectual topic is connected to another. So the question of laws of nature is related to topics in analytic ontology. For example, David Armstrong, whom we've been discussing, along with Dretske and Tooley, came up with a theory of independently of laws of nature as relations between universals. And in Armstrong's version at least, I think Tooley's and Dretske's, certainly Tooley's, these were thought of as contingent relations between universals. I don't understand how there can be contingent relations between universals. And so my analytic ontology, and this is connected very much with the topic of these lectures, my analytic ontology is one in which there cannot be contingent relations between universals. So if, as I hold, and if, as I think is conducive to theism, the laws of nature are contingent, there'd better be another account of it. And if, and this whole question of, is this a good theory of laws of nature, has these somewhat tenuous connections to science and religion. They're not sort of cast iron constraints, but they're relevant. And the question of analytic ontology is relevant to laws of nature. It's also relevant, the nature of possibility is relevant to these topics. Here's an example. I know it's out of date, but it illustrates the sort of thing we might have in mind. In classical mechanics, there was a way of formulating classical mechanics very elegantly as saying that the actual course of events is that which, among all the possible ones, minimizes or maximizes the quantity called action. It's called action. It's nothing to do with actions. It's just called action, in English at least. And this is a very elegant formulation and was used by Hilbert and simultaneously Einstein, who got it right eventually before Hilbert with the details, to deduce general relativity. It's important in classical non-quantum mechanics. But the thing to see about this is you have to say that it maximizes the action among all the possibilities. Now, I won't talk about quantum theory because it's a moving object. It's very hard to interpret because it keeps changing. But now, that interacts with ontology, because supposing you had a very a nominalist inclined view of the world, and you said, a bit like Quine or something, I don't believe in possibilities. There are no possibilities other than the actual. You're an extreme actualist. Well, that's got common sense appeal. I mean, you ask the average person, and they start talking about possibilities, and you know, you say, but you don't believe that possibilities, do you, other than the actual? That's just weird. For example, there's a thinker to whom I'm related by marriage in Tasmania, Desmond Fernley-Sander, who thinks about quantum mechanics, and he just finds it absurd that philosophers are always going on about possible worlds. If you just ask your average sort of well-educated person, why do philosophers keep on going on about these possible worlds? Have they read too much science fiction? I mean, but you see how it's connected, because going back to the classical and avoiding the quantum theory to avoid obscurity, you can't literally say the way to understand classical mechanics is to say the actual course of events is that which minimizes or maximizes this quantity, the action, however elegant it is, unless you're prepared to say something about the possibilities. Because obviously, if you say the actual minimizes the action, you're comparing the actual with all the other possibilities. And if you severe actualists say there are no other possibilities, this is just some way of speaking, that way of formulating mechanics should have no appeal to you as an account of how the world actually is. And you should say, well, no, that's just a mathematical convenience. It's nice mathematics, but it doesn't explain how the world is.
You are not saying that mathematics and analytic metaphysics are just tools for understanding theory.
No.
So you separate both things, because analytic metaphysics can be used against also those.
That's right. And of course, and one thing that happens, although it's always disappointing, but like in the sciences, sometimes if you discover that an interesting hypothesis is not true, you've still made a contribution. You can have the same kind of thing in analytic ontology, that there are positions which, if they were true, would have quite strong consequences elsewhere, and it's a pity that you can't say they're true. So, for example, something we've been discussing in these things is whether, briefly, I mean it's not central, whether there can be properties which have no instances. Now, if that's true, there cannot be, if it's, sorry, I've got a double negative here, but if there cannot be any properties without instances, if all properties have to have an instance, this I think has consequences, because I think on other grounds we're committed to properties of which we know no instances. So instead of using this to restrict the range of properties there are, which is what David Armstrong would have done, I say if every property has an instance, we're committed to a form of plenitude, of saying we can discover in various ways what properties there are, and we've been discussing this a bit, and there are ones which apparently have no instances. I gave the example of extremely high temperatures. But now, if we have a good argument that all properties have instances, we now have an argument, admittedly on rather a priori grounds, for a thesis that has some independent intuitive appeal. The idea of plenitude. And if you look at the history of philosophy, you'll see how it keeps coming up in different forms, the history of ideas. Plenitude, the idea that everything, well, in its extreme form, which I don't think is tenable, you say everything possible is actual. Now, that's an interesting thesis again, because I say the justly famous analytic metaphysician David Lewis, who regrettably died young, David Lewis, that's what he really believes. It's not what he said he believed. But that's a very extreme view, which I don't think is tenable. But the idea that every universal, every property, every relation has an instance is a more moderate view of plenitude, which I think is tenable. And I think it has further consequences. And at the risk of getting into too much detail, I think it has consequences for explaining what action is. Because I have a pet metaphysics, my little sort of metaphysics that I keep, pet here, which I stroke the fur of, that in the beginning, there were all possible spatio-temporal universes. And that what happens, both in quantum theory with the mysterious collapse of the wave packet, but also in observation by sentient beings, and also, and especially by, not especially, but most significantly, when we make a choice, is there are fewer possible worlds. So we're talking here about what ordinarily would be described as hypertime, because these worlds are all in space and time as we ordinarily consider it. I think that's back to front. I think we spatialize the t-coordinate of space-times. This is genuine time. So every action, every observation, and sometimes just spontaneously perhaps, there are fewer worlds than there were. Now, other than providing an interpretation of quantum theory, and other than being mind-boggling and getting you a reputation as an obscure bore at dinner parties, this theory provides a context for action. Because you can have free action without any violation of the laws of nature or anything on this theory. Why would you believe it? Well, I've just said it's got all these wonderful consequences. But another reason for believing it would be if you were committed to, or did believe, that there were no universals that didn't have instances, because on this view, they all have instances, they're just in the past. So in the original situation, the beginning of genuine time, all possibilities are instantiated. The whole plenitude is there. All possible space-times are instantiated. The whole plenitude is there. And so every universal has an instance. So that's why I would really like it to be the case that someone comes up with a good argument that there are no universals without instances. But here, as in science, the negative result is still important. We might like something to be the case, but if we find it isn't, that's still significant. It's analogous to this. There are people who spend real time and real money on seeking intelligent life out there in the universe, SETI. And if they discovered some, we would all be very excited. We'd all say, wow, that's really important. We've discovered intelligent life, say, 1,000 light years away. Okay, so far they haven't discovered any. I suspect they won't, not because I think there's no other intelligent life out there, it's just I think the conditions for intelligent life are so extreme, it'll just be a very long way away, that's all. I don't think it isn't out there. The universe is a very big place, it might even be infinite. But, so I think they're probably out there, but I doubt whether we'll get evidence of it. But I may be wrong, and if I'm wrong, that would be very interesting. But these people are spending their time and money on trying to find it. So it must be very disappointing for them if they get to the end of their career or even the end of their life and they don't find it. It's disappointing, but it's still intellectually valuable. It's intellectually valuable because the other position, the one that would be exciting, is something we need to know about it, and a negative result, even if it's inconclusive, is still important. And the same can happen with analytic ontology. So, for example, there would be considerable consequences for me and my theories if someone comes up with a good argument there can't be properties without instances, but as far as I can see there aren't, and that failure, although disappointing, is still intellectually important.
Today we have this, as you know, new metaphysics. I don't know if for you one meta is enough, or you also believe in metaphysics, in ontology. But still, if we don't believe, or we believe, I think that traditionally there have been a lot of metaphysical questions. For instance, what is the task of metaphysics? What are the tools for metaphysics to use for analysis, among others? So I would like to start asking you, what do you think that is the task of metaphysics or ontology? I don't know actually if you think that ontology and metaphysics are the same, or ontology is a part of metaphysics. So perhaps you can tell me first about it, and you can tell me what is the task of metaphysics. For instance, do you think that the task of metaphysics is to look for naturalness, to look for categories, to look for existence, to look for reality? As you know, we have a lot of paradigms. We have neo-Karnakian paradigms, we have neo-Quinian paradigms, we have neo-Aristotelian paradigms. So,
yeah, D.C. Williams is probably best known to people as the author of so-called trope theory. As you know, I think that's a terrible misuse of the word trope, but still. Trope theory also made the distinction between analytic ontology and speculative cosmology. And by speculative cosmology, he didn't just mean the sort of thing that scientific cosmologists do, though that's important and is on the borderline between metaphysics and physics. He also included such questions as whether there's God, and questions more generally of agency and things like that, and time. So the classification might be somewhat arbitrary, but philosophy of time and philosophy of space, but time poses more problems than space. Space poses problems. Are usually thought of as metaphysics, but not analytic ontology. That's just terminology. As I said, I think a lot of these intellectual issues are connected, but the intrinsic interest of questions to do with space and time is usually greater than that of analytic ontology. It's fairly easy to explain to people why we might be interested, for example, in whether the past is real. Presentists deny the reality of the past. I'm a growing block theorist. At one stage, someone claimed I was the only surviving growing block theorist, to which my response is the others are still real, they're just in the past. So, not really, it's not literally my part. But anyway, those questions people understand the importance of. Questions like what's the nature of possibility, are properties universal or particular, are much more abstruse in the sense that students generally don't immediately find them interesting. David Armstrong once suggested that a way to interest students initially in these problems was to discuss the identity of indiscernibles. Leibniz's thesis that there couldn't be two things with exactly the same nature, properties, etc. That this is something which does have immediate intuitive appeal. Of course, once you get interested in it, then the topics of analytic ontology acquire a certain amount of interest and importance. What's the role? Well, I guess I believe in a sort of unity of sciences thesis, in that I don't think there are sharp divisions between different inquiries, but there are divisions, they're just not sharp. And there's not some sharp division between somehow science, which is said to be purely empirical, and philosophy, which is somehow thought of as done in an armchair, which is sort of derisive, suggesting it's done in an armchair. I once had someone say to me, oh, you're a philosopher, I suspect you were just doing your work in an armchair. And I said, no, I was actually lying on a bed with a glass of wine. The idea that sort of, there's real hard work is done in a laboratory, that's rubbish. I would say, it's not merely a matter of accepting my arguments. Anyone who just thinks hard about it should realize that there's a non-empirical component to observation. And here, the discussion of naturalness, which is a discussion we've had in analytic ontology, comes right into this methodology of science.
Do you mean that we cannot have questions of ontology or task force metaphysics a priori?
Well, I do, but I'm actually now doing the other one. I'm saying now even a thoroughly empirical science actually has a component of the sort that philosophers are discussing with analytic ontology, namely that we treat certain classifications as naturalness. In Plato's memorable phrase, we carve nature at the joints. And if you don't, you can't make sensible observations. You can't even use low-level theories. You can't even use the sort of low-level theories required to do 18th century botany, say. Any kind of scientific theorizing, you will need to distinguish between more or less natural classifications. And this is not a trivial point, because sometimes scientific innovation consists in the discovery that something is natural, which wasn't previously thought of as natural, but after the event you say, yes, that's natural. So, for example, when Kepler proposed that, well, ellipses are very fine geometric figures, we've been discussing them for over 1,000 years. Why insist upon using circles to describe planetary motion? Why not use ellipses? He basically pointed out something to us which we hadn't previously noticed, that ellipses were natural, not just circles. And that was very important. But now, if you ask a skeptical question, you might say, yeah, but this naturalness is just a human thing we project onto the world. The kind of usual kind of projectivist garbage people propose so often about values and everything else, aesthetics and everything. It really annoys me. But you might say that about naturalness. But now this is where the analytic metaphysics comes in and the analytic ontology comes in, because we're talking about naturalness and we're talking about objective naturalness and how it's possible and how it occurs. And the whole theory of universals is a way of showing how there can be objective naturalness. It's not something that we as human beings project. God forbid it's not something that we in a decadent end of the Western culture project. As if, we could do it differently the way Feyerabend might have suggested. It's objective. We're carving nature at the joints. Plato was right. And the theory of universals can justify this, and if it's not tenable, that weakens that. Now, the other way around, yes, I'm saying I don't think these disciplines are, I think they're distinct. They're distinct because different people have the different capacity to do them well. As I keep saying, the beauty of philosophy is you don't have to do anything well to do philosophy. But different people have the capacity to do different things well, so the disciplines are distinct, but they're not watertight, and they're not sharply distinct. And the other way around, people talk about armchair philosophy as if somehow it's not connected with the world. That's not true. We're just letting other people do the dirty work. We're not ignoring what people do in laboratories any more than the theoretical physicist with her or his equations are ignoring what people do in the laboratory. They don't go into laboratories themselves, nor do philosophers. But we don't ignore those results. Anything that we think is established, we will take as established. Anything that we think is plausible or likely, we will take as plausible or likely. We don't do the work, and because we don't do the work, people think of the subject as armchair, which is correct, but someone else has done the work for us. So, for example, analytic ontology, which is usually thought of as the most abstruse, the most rarefied, the most armchair of all branches of philosophy, is very much aware that contemporary physics is sometimes stated in terms of particles and sometimes stated in terms of fields. I wish they could make up their mind, but I had occasion to mention, and it goes back to Keith Campbell, who was in a way another of my teachers, by the way, at Sydney, Keith Campbell, that the so-called trope theory works very well for fields. It works much better for fields than for a world of particles. If they're particles, you might wonder why the energy of the particle and the spin of the particle don't just go their separate ways sometimes. I mean, after all, they're just little different things. Why are they always going along together? Whereas on a field theory, a field is at a place suppose you have points. That's again is another dispute, but it's a dispute in metaphysics, the metaphysics of space, whether there are points. But suppose there are points. Then the value of a field at a point is a very good candidate for a so-called trope. Hence, given that so this works two ways. If the physicists could make up their mind and show us we really do have to have a field theory or really do have to have a particle theory, if that was the case, then that would impact on our metaphysics. It would make the trope theory that much more plausible, make the theory of universals that much less plausible, and that might have further consequences. To start off with, I don't think there can be, I don't think fictional tropes can do much interesting work in metaphysics, whereas I think universals that have merely fictional instances can. So they're consequences of whether trope theory is correct. And if we had a field theory in physics, which itself would be based on a lot of a priori mathematics, plus other people doing a whole lot of experiments, they never get the glory, of course. It's the mathematical physicists that get the honor and glory, but it all depends upon people doing experiments under the ground in Geneva that get these results. If a field theory were to be established, that would tend to support trope theory. Conversely, if in fact the physical theory can be stated either in terms of particles or fields, then the answer to the question, what have the scientists shown us about the world? And that's why I'm interested in science. It's not technology. I hate machines. Machines hate me. End of story. I want to know about the world. And so that answer, if the physics doesn't tell us, the best answer, it won't be conclusive, but the best answer we could have would be based on the analytic ontology. Because then we would have to say, if on other grounds you think trope theory is correct, we should believe the world is made up of fields. If on other grounds you think the theory of universals is correct, we, for arguments I haven't gone into here to do with the curvature of space-time, the problem of giving a universals analysis of fields in curved space-time, it's a problem that's soluble with some complexity, and it's in the literature, and I won't go into it. We probably should prefer particle theory. So if the point of science is to tell us how the world is, the point of science is not, I say, to give us ever more gadgets we don't need. The point of science is to tell us how the world is so we understand and appreciate it and see the beauty of it and wonder at it. And if they can't tell us, we, the analytic metaphysicians, will come up with an inconclusive answer. If they can tell us, that will affect the analytic metaphysics. So that sort of answers the question. Everything's interconnected intellectually, but loosely. There's an empirical component in what we ordinarily think of as an a priori discipline, and there's an a priori component in what we ordinarily think of. Now, of course, I know that's controversial. I have a colleague who thinks that philosophy is a completely separate sort of inquiry, and I'm sure you all have colleagues like that.
Right, so it's your claim, of course, that questions of metaphysics or ontology are just substantive when they get information from the sciences.
Depends what you mean by substantive. No, they're of intrinsic interest.
As you know, we have in the metaphysically seen people declaring metaphysical questions are trivial, are non-substantive, things like that, or nonsensical, or
Yeah.
devoid
Okay.
of cognitive content, things like
Yeah,
that.
right. Well,
But then you're saying that there is a way to go in which the task of metaphysics becomes substantive because of the empirical component.
not quite. Yeah, sorry. What I'd actually say of this is two things. One is...
for instance, so tell me how, for instance, the question about categories becomes substantive in this approach that I guess that is related to if fields are substances or not.
Yeah. Okay, but two things that I want to say. First of all, the presumption is always that an intellectual inquiry is what it seems to be at face value. You seem to be looking at the nature of things, and if it's important, as I think it obviously is, that science tells us the nature of things, it's also important, I'm not saying it's as important, but it's also important that analytic ontology tells us the nature of things. That's a presumption. Someone can now argue on various grounds, oh, it's meaningless, or perhaps more plausibly, different metaphysical views are actually equivalent. They're really saying the same thing in different ways. People can argue that. And if I have time, I will look at those arguments. In principle, I'll look at the arguments. And if I was in a seminar situation and someone came up with those arguments, I'd think about them. So I'm not saying I know in advance they won't work, but I wait for the arguments. No one's going to tell me in advance that what is presumptively the case, that when I engage in inquiry as to what there is in the world, that there's something wrong with that. I'm not doing something that's similar to what scientists are doing. Then I have what is really an argument that shows two things. It shows, one, analytic ontology is worth funding. okay, an argument to persuade other people that what I'm doing is not merely intrinsically interesting, but extrinsically so. Because this is something that's true of all kinds of inquiry. The inquiry is intrinsically interesting. People say, but is it relevant? And a natural reaction to that is say, I couldn't give a damn if it's relevant. Why should it be relevant? But that's not quite right. Because if something has interest intrinsically, and it is relevant to something else that has intrinsic interest, but it acquires greater interest and importance. You can't say everything has to be relevant to something else in order to be interesting, then you're going round in circles. But what you can say is a whole lot of questions of intrinsic interest, but a question which is relevant to other questions of intrinsic interest becomes of more interest and importance. So that answers the question of why fund analytic ontology, or as my teacher David Stove put it, why bother feeding philosophers? And so there's intrinsic interest, but we won't persuade agencies that provide money to fund us that we should do it just because it has intrinsic interest. Sometimes we will, but it often helps if you say what its importance is. Sometimes I have had to comment on research applications for grants, and one of the questions they have to answer is, what's the importance of this? To which my answer usually is, nothing. His answer is that nothing academics do could be more important than discovering the truth of these matters. That's not the sort of answer they're looking for. They want to know how it's going to make rich people richer. I'm not interested in how it makes rich people richer. That's part of the answer, that you acquire extra interest by being relevant. The other thing that's important here is a matter of, okay, suppose someone comes up with some sort of argument against me that says analytic ontology isn't really about anything, it's not a proper topic. Then, of course, these arguments that trope theory might be connected to field theory and so on, then they can be used as counter-arguments to an argument that someone has that for some reason or other, someone who's read Carnap might come up with this. Quite a lot of people are Carnap scholars, David Chalmers and some other people. And Carnap had a very sophisticated position, an interesting position. I mean, I think he was wrong about most things, but he had an interesting position. Except probability, perhaps he wasn't wrong about probability. But he had an interesting position on these things in which, you make some postulates which are just sort of, they're not objective, they just sort of come out of, as just a basic idea. So analytic ontology then wouldn't be a discovery about the world. I'll tell you someone else who's worth looking at if you're looking for a philosopher who needs to be sort of brought back into the light, but I don't agree with, is Collingwood. And Collingwood was an archaeologist, and his idea was that what philosophers do is discover the presuppositions of a culture, what we just take for granted. And the idea is that an intellectual bit of a culture, a zeitgeist, if you want to use that word, consists of what people take for granted so much they find it difficult even to think whether it's true or false. So I'm not talking here about people who have faith in something, politics, religion, or whatever, because they at least can conceive of it not being right, true. We're talking about things people just take for granted without even thinking about it. Now, Collingwood thought that what philosophers are really doing when they think they're discovering truths is discovering the presuppositions of their own worldview, and you can argue that's an important activity. Now, suppose someone has some such view of Carnap or Collingwood and says, well, that's all you're doing, and I can say, yeah, well, I can see those are both intellectually interesting positions. These people aren't stupid. They're not saying something silly. They're not saying, oh, if you analyze the truth, you're pinning it down like a butterfly and that kills it. To which my response is, and where did you go for your last vacation? I mean, I just don't want to continue that discussion. But no, they've got something sensible to say. And then my response to that might be, okay, now I'll try to show you why this is connected to more substantive questions, which I think helps to rebut the argument that it's not really about anything.
So you have talked about how metaphysics can relate overall to science, science, or how metaphysicians approach science, or how some questions, philosophical questions, become substantive when we look at science. I have a twofold question. That is, what we have today forms of scientism, naturalism, materialism, eliminativism, emergentism. So, first, what would be, according to you, the relationship between science and metaphysics? And on the other hand, which one should be the method of analysis? For instance, some think that the method of analysis should be mereology, some think that the method of analysis should be predicate logic, some of them think the method could be set theory. So I would like to know, what do you think that is the relationship between science and metaphysics, and what should be the logic or tools for analysis apart from the evidence from the sciences?
Okay, well, the relation between science and metaphysics, and here I'm going to include mathematics as the science, as I said before, it works both ways. So the one question you want to ask is this: can we justify the presumptive or prima facie or pro tanto judgment that these scientists, these mathematicians are doing something really important intellectually? This is good stuff. This is really valuable. And I don't mean instrumentally. Okay? Can we justify that? That's one way. And the other way is, what do the sciences have to tell us about the proper methodology for philosophy? Now, both those go both ways. So I've already said that one of the things scientists tell us about is the laws of nature, and that's important, I think, if we can say they made a discovery. There are other issues which we've touched on, in particular because of, Cal, your talk. We touched on the question of whether, what we're to say about our knowledge of the qualities that appear in the scientific theories. Because after all, it's rather disappointing if a scientific theory says, this is the wonderful theory of everything, oh, but I don't know what I'm talking about. I have the same impatience with that as I have with and I've met this a lot, with a theologian or a religiously committed person who says, oh, I worship God, but I've got no idea what God is. So it's my response, oh, why worship God if you don't know what God is? I mean, don't understand. I have the same response with science. Wonderful story about how the world is, I agree. And then someone says, of course, we don't know what it's talking about. So we've got those issues in which analytic ontology feeds into justifying our presumptive judgments that this is about the truth. And the same goes for mathematics. And coming back to this brief just reply about my own biography, not that it's of any interest to anyone, least of all myself, is one of the ironies was when I was a mathematician, I didn't really think mathematics was about anything, so I didn't think it was worth doing. But once I did some metaphysics, I now thought mathematics was really important because it's about something. And when I did philosophy of religion, I came to the conclusion that to study mathematics is to study the intrinsic nature of God. Mathematics reflects the nature of God. So one of the ironies is I left mathematics because I thought it was about nothing to do philosophy. And once I did philosophy, I decided mathematics was about something. And so one of the questions we can ask is which bits of mathematics are about something? Now, we're not going to get definite answers from the analytic ontologists, but it helps. It gives us some indication, and in particular, and I'm going to be discussing this in the lecture tomorrow, in particular, we can discuss whether some bits of mathematics are really making discoveries about universals, and whether some is just talk. And on the whole, good mathematics, I say, is you're making discovery about the way the world is. I can admit that sometimes, and I myself I think was guilty of this at one stage, you can write a PhD thesis on something which is a mathematical problem but isn't sort of really there. But I think the study of analytic ontology can do a lot to show people that both, not just science, but mathematics have a genuine topic, which can be a worry. What's science really about? Does it tell us anything about anything? And what's even more so about mathematics? So analytic ontology can show us, yes, this is what numbers are, and yes, pi really does exist. I know that sounds a bit like the saying Santa Claus really does exist to someone, but I say pi really does exist. Now the other way around, which I think is what Javier was really more interested in, is methodology. Yeah. Okay. Certain sciences have certain intellectual disciplines have succeeded spectacularly well. The physical sciences, biology, history, I mean they're not just all sciences, linguistics, psychology, the way they do it at my university, applied statistics, that is. They succeeded really well. Other intellectual attempts haven't succeeded so well, and that may not be the fault of the protagonists. But there's a lot of stuff goes on in universities which I think is just a waste of time. Now the question is, should we learn a lesson from this? Should we do metaphysics the way scientists do science, or the way mathematicians do mathematics? No, there are differences, as we discover. But it can, so I don't think one thing I think we ought to reject is a priori methodological naturalism. Methodological naturalism is the view that when you do science, you stick to certain kinds of explanations. Let us suppose you're a pious Christian and a physicist. I had one such when I was, at least one such, but one who was explicit about it, when I was an undergraduate. But obviously, God doesn't enter into your physics if you're a scientist, if you're a physicist. Obviously, this is actually one of those presuppositions of the age, one of those things that people think is so obvious they don't even ask, and you should ask why, but it's true. Okay. So methodological naturalism is the thesis that when you do science, you seek only naturalistic explanations. I think it's justified. Should you be a methodological naturalist when it comes to metaphysics? Of course not, because one of the questions you want to ask is whether science is all there is, whether naturalism is correct. Obviously, you can't be a methodological naturalist, you're just begging the question. What you can do, and what is intellectually legitimate, is to say, as we all say, I can't look at every possible topic. I'm entitled to take certain things for granted while I discuss other things. And if people are naturalists, they can say at their own risk, I will assume naturalism and see where it leads me. Now, this might or might not be a good research program in philosophy. It's certainly good in the sciences. You may find that if you're committed, say, to naturalism, I've argued elsewhere you should not be committed to naturalism, but if you are committed to naturalism, and if you just say, look, I can't be always talking about everything, I'm going to assume naturalism, that may be a mistake, it may not be a mistake. I mean, not in the sense that naturalism may or may not be correct, but in the sense it may or may not be productive in your theorizing. So in that sense, a metaphysician can be a naturalist and assume naturalism at their own risk. You don't want to have the, I think it's a mistake, but you can have a valid research program in which you take certain things for granted. We all do, we have to. So in that sense, you could say, okay, I will learn the lesson of the sciences and be a methodological naturalist in philosophy. I'm inclined to say, no, philosophy is more wide-ranging than that. The things you're going to have to assume, I have other things you can assume. I mean, here's something I assume, that I'm not going to greatly increase the range of positions I need to consider or the arguments I need to use by studying Sanskrit. Now, I say that even though I respect Indian culture and respect Indian philosophy, and some Indians think I must have been reincarnated, I must have spent my previous existence in India, because I'm so pro-Indian on a lot of things. I love the heat, I love the food, I love almost everything about India other than the residual poverty, which is getting less and less, thank God. But they think I must have come from India, and I just got reborn in the north of England because of bad karma. So I'm not a cultural chauvinist here. I celebrate the fact that Brahmagupta discovered negative numbers, he didn't invent them, and so on. Nonetheless, I don't know Sanskrit because I'm an appalling linguist. I don't know Sanskrit, and I don't think it would greatly increase the range of positions I could think about if I did. Now that's something I just assume as part of my research program. We always all have to assume something. There's some philosophers who say, I don't need to know any mathematics. That's fine. I mean, there's always a risk in these assumptions. So, so as regards what the sciences tell the philosopher methodologically, I'm inclined to think there are no firm constraints here, but it's intellectually legitimate to say, well, look, I'm going to make, just as I say, I'm not going to greatly increase the range of positions I could consider by looking at philosophers in languages I don't understand. I might note them in translation, etc. I'm not going to go and study people in the original because I'm no good at it. That's a constraint. Likewise, if you are a naturalist, I think you're mistaken, but you might say, look at the lesson of the sciences, this works. Or if you are mathematically inclined, you might think philosophy can learn a lot from mathematicians and you can have formal definitions. What's the best answer I can do to that question? Okay.
Thank you for this, Peter.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Javier.
Thanks, Peter, for